Liam pushed the door open to find Ethan, as predictably as the tides, engaged in his self-styled indoor triathlon, shirtless despite the ambient chill of the research station. He quickly secured the lock, pulling off his heavy gloves and rubbing his hands together for warmth. Liam crouched beside the rhythmically rising and falling figure, a grin spreading across his face. He joked that Ethan must be deliberately flaunting his physique for his benefit. Suggesting he'd be a prime candidate for the rumored polar plunge the Russian team was planning to celebrate the return of the sun. Ethan ignored him, his focus absolute, ensuring each push-up was executed with perfect form. Liam sighed theatrically, his gaze sweeping over the defined muscles with an air of practiced appreciation before he asked his daily, pointless question about whether Ethan was cold. After receiving the expected grunt of denial, Liam declared himself aesthetically fatigued by the display of male perfection and moved to the desk to check his email. A sudden, sharp curse from Liam finally broke Ethan's concentration. He was 3 reps shy of his daily goal, but the explosive sound made his eardrums ring. He glanced up. It was unusual. Liam, for all his incessant chatter, rarely swore, but after the initial outburst, Liam fell silent. It wasn't until Ethan had finished his set, stood up, and pulled a thermal shirt over his head that Liam finally spoke, his voice trembling. He stammered, asking what he should do. Ethan, toweling sweat from his neck, asked what he was talking about. It was his crush, Liam explained, the girl he'd been pining over for months. He thought she had just confessed her feelings for him in an email. Ethan paused. Liam was rubbing his hands frantically on his thighs, admitting he'd only glanced at it, too nervous to read it properly. He needed to prepare himself mentally, he declared. A sharp ping from the computer cut through Liam's agitated preparations. Liam pointed at the screen, his voice a squeak, telling Ethan he had an email and should look at his first while Liam got some water to compose himself. Ethan looked at Liam, a single word flashing in his mind: pathetic. For months, Ethan's inbox had only ever contained 2 types of messages: junk mail and emails from a friend named Zoe. And just yesterday Zoe had sent him a long, rambling complaint about how the station's cook had managed to make a sweet-tasting tofu scramble. So he doubted she'd be writing again so soon. He had no desire to look, but Liam's frantic insistence pushed him into the chair, intending to simply clear out his spam folder. But when he maximized the window, his hand froze on the mouse. The email wasn't junk. It had a sender name, a garbled, old-school screen name with a jumble of letters and numbers he didn't recognize, but it was clearly from a person. The subject line was a single word: notice. The body contained only one short, brutal line: Isla asked me to tell you, she's dead. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't place the name. Isla. Then it clicked, and the warmth generated by his workout vanished as if sucked into a vacuum. A chill shot through him, prickling at his fingertips. He stared at the email for a full minute before his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, to click the red X and close the window. He ignored Liam, who was now practicing deep breathing exercises by the water cooler. He pulled on another 2 layers of clothing, then mechanically donned his heavy parka, hat, and face mask. He opened the door and stepped out. There was, of course, no sun. The perpetual twilight of the Antarctic winter swallowed him whole. He walked forward, paying no mind as the station's lights dwindled behind him, his head bowed against the wind. The permanently frozen snow crunched under his boots, a sound that merged with the keening of the wind, a desolate rhythm beating against his numb senses. Did you finally get what you wanted? He didn't know how far he'd walked when the wind intensified, a sudden gale that threw him off balance. He squinted against the storm of snow and ice crystals that danced furiously in the air. His body leaned into the gale, but he fought it, stubbornly placing one foot in front of the other as if in defiance of some unseen adversary. Then his right foot found nothing but air. A dizzying sensation of weightlessness consumed him as he watched the world tip over, the horizon flipping on its axis. On the 17th day of the Antarctic polar night, Ethan realized he might finally be succumbing to what they called polar T3 syndrome. His thoughts grew sluggish, his perception of the world around him dulled, and his emotions plunged into a bottomless chasm. No matter how deeply he breathed, he couldn't seem to draw in enough oxygen. As his head hit the ice, a bizarre thought surfaced in the blackness of his mind. He wondered if this was what dying felt like. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was Caleb. It was from that night at the party, when Ethan had stood there stammering his way through a thank you speech. He had turned, and Caleb was leaning back comfortably in his chair, hands loosely clasped in his lap, his head tilted slightly, a faint, knowing smile on his lips as he watched him. The colorful lights of the bar reflected in his eyes, and at the very center of that reflection was Ethan himself. When Ethan came to, the distant sound of Miller's shouting was the first thing to register. Liam's sharp eyes spotted him first, and he yelled out his name. By the time Ethan stumbled back to the assembled group and stood before his supervisor, a furious tirade crashed down on him. Miller roared about whether Ethan thought the search and rescue team had nothing better to do than chase after him. He gestured wildly at the team, already assembled and ready to deploy. He reminded Ethan, his voice thick with rage, of the cardinal rule: no one leaves the station unauthorized. He demanded to know if Ethan understood English and if he had any idea how long he'd been gone. Ethan coughed, his throat raw. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "Don't you dare say you're sorry to me," Miller bellowed, his anger escalating as his eyes fell on Ethan's disheveled state. He noticed the snow caked on his back and his voice rose another octave, questioning if he'd actually fallen into a crevasse. Ethan just stared at the ground, silent. Miller accused him of having a death wish. Liam quickly stepped in, putting an arm around the supervisor's shoulders. He murmured that it was okay, that Ethan was back safe now. He mouthed silently to Miller, "He's not in a good way." Miller glanced at the small crowd of curious onlookers that had gathered, took a few deep breaths to regain some composure, then jabbed a finger at Ethan. "Report. For 1,000 words on my desk by morning." Writing a 4,000-word report was an impossible task for Ethan in his current state. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Liam, lying on his bunk, advised him to just forget it. Once Miller cooled down, a few words of apology would probably smooth things over. Ethan sat for a while longer but managed to write nothing beyond the title. He couldn't explain his actions, not even to himself. He didn't know what had caused the sudden, catastrophic emotional collapse. He decided to get some sleep. As he was pulling off his shirt, Liam let out a triumphant howl. Before Ethan could react, his shirt was still over his head when the world spun, and he found himself hoisted over Liam's shoulder. "Christ!" Ethan yelled, ripping the shirt off his head. "Are you insane?" Lifting Ethan was a struggle for Liam, and no sooner had Ethan spoken than they both tumbled onto the bed in a heap. Ethan sighed, looking up at his roommate in utter exasperation, only to find the man grinning like an idiot. "She told me she loves me," Liam announced, beaming down at him, his smile a flash of white teeth. People in love were morons. Ethan decided not to argue with a moron. He nudged Liam's head. "Get off. I don't share a bed with other men." Liam, lost in the bliss of those 3 words, completely missed the implication in Ethan's statement. He pinned Ethan down, grabbing his hand and pressing it to his chest so he could feel the frantic, joyful rhythm of his heart. Ethan, unimpressed, pulled his hand away. He asked if this was Liam's first love. Liam confirmed it was. He was ecstatic, declaring it was the first time anyone, let alone the girl he'd adored for years, had ever said they loved him. He felt like he was going crazy, so energized he wanted to go for that naked run with the Russians after all. He then asked Ethan if it was like this for him, the first time he heard it from someone he loved. The question made Ethan freeze. He stared at the ceiling, Liam's cheerful voice buzzing in his ears. After a long moment, a single hollow word escaped his lips. No. Liam was confused. He never said it to me, Ethan thought. Perhaps the dejection on Ethan's face was too stark, because Liam, though not understanding why, didn't press the issue. While Liam was still trying to figure it out, Ethan pushed him off and stood up. Later, after they had both washed up and were lying in their separate bunks, the darkness was broken by Liam's voice. He called out Ethan's name. After a moment of silence, Ethan responded with a quiet hum. Liam asked carefully if he was feeling down. Ethan didn't answer. Liam continued, pointing out that Ethan had been at the station for nearly 9 months. In such an enclosed, isolated environment, it was easy for people to get depressed. Liam himself had only been there for 5 months and was already feeling the strain. Ethan managed a small, humorless laugh, remarking that Liam hardly seemed depressed. Liam admitted he was naturally cheerful, but Ethan was different, more withdrawn and quiet. He grew serious, telling Ethan that what he did today, going out alone without a word, was incredibly dangerous. When the SAR team was describing the potential hazards, Miller's eyes had turned red with worry. He made Ethan promise not to do it again, offering to accompany him if he needed to get out, or at the very least to tell someone. Ethan agreed it wouldn't happen again. He tried to explain that today had been different, but the words wouldn't come. Thankfully, Liam was understanding. He offered a few more words of comfort, suggesting that if he was still feeling low, he should talk to the station's counselor. You couldn't keep things bottled up in a place like this. Just as Liam thought the conversation was over, Ethan suddenly asked if he and his girl were officially together now. Liam was flattered by the question. Since arriving, he and Ethan had been roommates, and while they talked, it was always Liam who initiated. Ethan had never once shown any interest in his personal life. He confirmed that they were, his voice filled with renewed excitement. He said it felt like a dream. He'd never had the courage to tell her how he felt, always thinking he wasn't good enough for her, only for her to confess first. Ethan was silent for a couple of seconds before asking why he felt he wasn't good enough. Liam explained it was the difference between a mere mortal and a goddess. Congratulations. Then, Ethan said quietly. Then he asked another question. What made her his goddess? Forgetting Ethan's unusual mood, Liam launched into a torrent of praise. She was beautiful, of course, but she was also an incredibly kind person. They had been in the same literature class in college. He just felt everything about her was perfect. He recalled one time he was giving a presentation and got so nervous he forgot his lines. She was in the audience, and she just smiled at him and started a soft, encouraging round of applause. It was so gentle. Liam went on, and Ethan listened patiently, making a small sound of acknowledgement or asking a question here and there. Finally, Liam turned the tables. He asked Ethan about himself, guessing he didn't have a girlfriend but that there was someone he liked. Ethan asked how he knew. Liam explained that he never saw Ethan calling a girlfriend, but he often caught him staring into space or looking at his phone for long periods. One time, Liam had accidentally glanced over and seen him looking at his photo gallery. He hadn't seen clearly, but he thought it was a picture of someone's profile. Ethan was quiet for a moment before admitting, "There is someone I like. A lot." Liam hesitated, unsure if he should pry further. But it felt like, in the quiet of the polar night, Ethan had opened up to him, just a little. He decided to risk it. He asked if they had ever been together. Ethan said they had. Liam's next question was softer, asking if they were broken up now. Ethan, lying on his side, opened his eyes in the dark. His hand instinctively reached under his pillow, his fingers closing around a cool, rectangular piece of plastic. He held the card for a long time before he finally spoke, his voice slow and measured. "No, we're not broken up. Not together, but not broken up." Liam mulled it over, sensing a long and complicated story behind those words. He wisely chose not to ask any more questions. Instead, he let out a long, quiet sigh. "I'm really curious," he said to the roommate who never let anyone get close. "What kind of person could make you fall for them?" Perhaps it was Liam's question, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan dreamt of Caleb that night. At first, it was just that look, the way Caleb had watched him with that focused, knowing gaze. Then the scene shifted abruptly. Caleb had a fistful of his shirt collar, pulling him close. His eyes, hazy with drink, held a playful glint as he asked if he wanted to. Their breath was hot, mingling in the space between them, blurring all sense of propriety. Ethan's gaze traced the line of Caleb's eyes, his nose, and finally, his lips. His throat was tight as he forced out a single, raspy question about whether Caleb was drunk. Caleb just laughed, leaning in even closer, and the proximity made Ethan's head spin, a pleasant numbness spreading through him. "Ethan," Caleb had murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It's now or never." In the dream, he had kissed him without hesitation. A frantic, desperate kiss filled with all the raw longing and intense passion of his youth. It was a wildfire that consumed everything. In the darkness of the barracks, Ethan woke up and pressed a hand over his heart. On his 264th day in Antarctica, the thought of Caleb still made it pound against his ribs. After finishing up his work at the lab, Caleb finally drove home. It was already 1 in the morning. He yawned, rubbing his eyes until they watered, and scanned the street for a parking spot. That was the downside of living in an older apartment complex. Parking was a free-for-all. With more and more people buying cars over the years, the designated spots were long gone. People squeezed their vehicles into any available gap, and by this time of night, when everyone was home, even the narrow access roads were lined with cars. It took him considerable effort to maneuver his car into a tight space. When he finally got out, he felt like he'd just retaken his driving test and passed with flying colors. He let out a breath and felt around in his pocket, deciding to have a cigarette before heading up. He'd spent the last 2 days holed up in the lab to meet a deadline, and his head was throbbing from staring at a computer screen. The familiar taste of tobacco brought a wave of relief. It was late, and nearly all the windows in the building were dark. The humid, sweltering summer night seemed to have settled into a pool of silence, its warmth seeping into his very bones. As Caleb ambled toward his building, he noticed that even the stray cat that usually lingered by the rusty playground equipment was nowhere to be seen. He didn't expect to see anyone else awake at this hour. But there was Ethan, perched on the low wall of a planter box. He was wearing a black t-shirt and a black baseball cap, and in front of him was the black cat with the distinctive white stripe down its back. He was hunched over, his head down, feeding the cat. The boy and the cat seemed to blend perfectly into the vast darkness. Caleb watched the boy gently stroking the cat's head as he took a drag from his cigarette. Then he called out his name, "Ethan." Hearing the voice, Ethan turned. He seemed surprised to see who it was. "Caleb," he said, his voice a little rough. He stood up and hopped down from the wall. The movement startled the cat, which darted back a few steps, its eyes wide and wary as it watched the two figures. Ethan asked if Caleb was just getting back. He didn't move closer, but Caleb could still make out the dark bruises near his eye and at the corner of his mouth. He frowned and walked toward him. He asked why Ethan wasn't in bed at this hour. Before Ethan could answer, Caleb reached out with his free hand and gently cupped Ethan's chin, tilting his face to get a better look. He noted the fight he'd clearly been in. Ethan tried to pull away but couldn't. He fixed his gaze on the glowing tip of the cigarette in Caleb's other hand and gave a barely perceptible nod. The black cat, having decided the newcomer was not a threat, sidled back to the half-eaten beef jerky on the ground. Up close, Caleb could see that the cut near Ethan's eye was worse than he'd thought. It was dangerously close to his eye, the skin split open. He asked if he'd had a doctor look at it, pointing out that it was bleeding. He let go of Ethan's chin, and the boy immediately straightened his back, shaking his head and saying it wasn't necessary. Because Ethan was now standing at his full height, Caleb was struck by the realization that he hadn't seen him properly in a long time. The boy had shot up. Caleb's eye level was now only just above Ethan's mouth. His hair had grown out too, long enough that the brim of his cap pressed stray strands down over his eyes. Caleb noticed a few hairs touching the wound and frowned, brushing them away. Ethan froze at the touch. He suddenly asked why Caleb was home so late. Caleb explained he had work at the university. Ethan wanted to say that he shouldn't have driven so late if he had work, that it was dangerous. But before he could, Caleb added that it was the first day of school tomorrow and he'd promised his sister, Kira, he would drive her. Good thing I didn't say anything, Ethan thought, kicking at a loose pebble on the ground. They walked toward the building entrance, one behind the other. As they passed the dumpsters, Caleb stopped to take one last drag from his cigarette before stubbing it out. When he looked up, he found Ethan watching him, his handsome eyes hidden in the shadow of his cap's brim. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Ethan shook his head without a word and followed him inside. Caleb told him to come to his apartment. Even if he didn't want to go to the hospital, he needed to at least clean the cuts. He pointed to his own eye, that an infection there could be serious. Ethan's hand was already in his pocket, his fingers wrapped around the cool metal of his key. He looked at his own apartment door across the hall and shook his head again. "It's fine. Don't worry. They're all asleep," Caleb assured him. Ethan still shook his head. Caleb didn't push him. Instead, he said softly, "Then wait here for a second. I'll get you some antiseptic and bandages." Ethan stood there, clutching his key. The motion-activated light in the hallway flickered off, plunging them into darkness. He didn't move to turn it back on. "Why didn't you go in?" Caleb asked, emerging from his apartment with a small first aid kit. Then understanding dawned on him. "Is MS West home?" Ethan nodded. "Apply the white cream first, then the green one," Caleb said, handing Ethan a small plastic bag. "I put some cotton swabs in there. Use a mirror and be careful not to get it in your eye." "Okay." Ethan took the bag, the plastic crinkling in his tight grip. After a couple of seconds, he added, "Thanks, Caleb." Caleb looked at the boy, his head slightly bowed. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Sometimes he felt as if Ethan was frozen in time, stuck in that one summer while everyone else moved on, accumulating the dust and light of their own lives. Only Ethan remained, perpetually silent and withdrawn, as if he had no connection to anyone at all. The next morning, Caleb shut off his alarm after a single ring. He got out of bed and went through his routine of showering and making breakfast. When he brought the food to the table, he found his sister, Kira, already dressed and waiting patiently. "You're back." Kira beamed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "What time did you get in?" "Around 11, I think." Kira loved fried eggs, especially when the yolk was still a little runny. Caleb thought he'd cooked them perfectly today, so he didn't say anything when she immediately reached for an egg instead of eating something else first. She ate with obvious delight, and even the way she opened the front door was light and cheerful. But as soon as the door was open, a shrill, female voice pierced the morning quiet. The door to the apartment opposite theirs was wide open. From where they stood, Caleb could clearly see the chaotic state of the living room. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and even the sofa cushions were lying on the floor. "Looking for your keys again, are you? Is your brain made of mush? What the hell are you doing making such a racket this early in the morning?" Caleb could only hear the voice, not see the person. He was holding Kira's backpack and gently nudged her shoulder, signaling for her to head downstairs. After a few steps, Kira paused and looked back. "Come on, you'll be late," Caleb urged. Kira sighed and continued down the stairs. "Ms. West is yelling at Ethan again." Caleb's family and Ethan's lived across the hall from each other, but unfortunately, they did not share a close, neighborly relationship. To be more precise, in this 6-story apartment building with its peeling paint, most residents got along reasonably well. The sole exception was Ethan's family, and it was all because of Ethan's mother, a woman whose words were as sharp as daggers, who had managed to offend every single family in the building. Caleb's own mother had cut off all contact after the woman had referred to her as a sickly thing who was going to die young. She never forgave her, and by extension, she stopped looking out for Ethan as she once had. Ethan never set foot in their apartment again, nor in anyone else's. Kira could never understand it. Ms. West was a beautiful woman. Even in her 40s, she looked young for her age. With such enviable natural gifts, why did she have to be so venomous? "You got into another fight? Can't even get a goddamn word out of you. You're just like your deadbeat father, with that same broke-ass look on your face." Hearing this, Caleb stopped in his tracks. He looked up through the railing of the staircase. From this angle, he could only see a narrow sliver of the open doorway. "Caleb?" Kira called up to him from the landing below. Suddenly, the door upstairs slammed shut, silencing the woman's one-sided tirade. This was Kira's first day of high school. Before she got out of the car, Caleb, still worried, grabbed her arm. "It's the first week. If they make you do any heavy cleaning, you have to tell the teacher about my condition. Call you or mom and dad if I don't feel well. Don't push myself and go home to rest." Kira finished for him in one breath. She turned her head and gave him an exasperated look. "Caleb, you and mom have said this 1,000 times. Don't you think you're overreacting? That's why I said I should just talk to your teacher myself, to avoid any problems later." "No," Kira refused flatly. "I can handle it." Caleb nodded and let go of her arm. "Do you have your inhaler?" "Yes." "Okay. Be careful." Kira smiled and agreed, then made a playful face at him and waved as she closed the car door. Caleb waited until she was safely inside the school building before pulling away. As he drove back toward the apartment complex, he saw Ethan on his red mountain bike. The boy was wearing his school uniform now, the cap gone, and the ever-present headphones were back in his ears. He was riding fast, leaning into the turns with the bike, creating a graceful arc. The white headphone cord caught the morning sun. As Caleb drove past him, he had a fleeting thought, noticing the yellow stripe on the boy's uniform. "He's a senior now." Caleb planned to finish all his doctoral coursework in his first year, so his schedule was packed. He usually went home at least once every other week, but this semester he had to stay at school for over a month. He only managed to skip a class and go home for Kira's birthday. He bought a cake and made a special trip to the bakery near the high school to get the specific kind of candles Kira liked. As he was walking along the path by the flower beds toward the bakery, he saw a boy in a school uniform jump down from the high perimeter wall. The boy landed in a crouch, then straightened up, dusting off his sleeves. Suddenly, the boy looked up, and his eyes met Caleb's. It was the high school uniform of a senior and a familiar face. Caleb took the cigarette from his lips and looked at him with a half-smile, then glanced pointedly at the wall. Ethan began. Then, seeing Caleb's expression, he sighed in frustration. I had a stomach ache. I was going to buy some medicine. As if on cue, a backpack flew over the wall and landed squarely on Ethan's shoulder. Damn it, Caleb let out a short laugh, the hand holding his cigarette trembling with amusement. Ethan bit his lip and lowered his head, feeling utterly foolish under Caleb's gaze. All he wanted was to disappear. I have to go, Caleb, he muttered. With that, he snatched up his backpack, hopped over the low hedge, and hailed a cab, making a hasty escape. Caleb watched his retreating back, shaking his head with a silent, amused smile. Why was he running? Caleb hadn't said anything. He walked a few more steps and looked up at the spot on the wall where Ethan had jumped from. It was quite high. He, for one, would have been afraid of breaking a leg. The high school had evening study sessions. Caleb sent Kira a message, telling her to ask her teacher for permission to leave early. He picked her up before the evening session began. Kira was thrilled to see the big cake and the spread of food on the table when they got home. The family chatted until 10 o'clock. Kira said she was enjoying high school. The classes weren't too hard, and she had made many new friends. Before bed, Kira snuck up to Caleb and held up one finger, asking if she could have just one more small piece of cake. Caleb personally cut a very thin slice for her. Kira accepted the meager piece, not forgetting to comment on his precise knife skills. As she was eating, she saw Caleb cut another, much larger slice. What time do the seniors get out of their evening session? He asked. Kira tilted her head, thinking. 9:50, I think. The first and second years who live off campus can leave at 9:20. But the boarders and seniors have another short session until 9:50. Caleb nodded. He carefully placed the large slice of cake on a new paper plate, sticking a fork in an empty spot. Take this to Ethan, he said, handing the plate to Kira. He glanced at the clock. He should be back by now. Kira tiptoed across the hall and knocked on the opposite door, but there was no response. She pressed her ear to the door. It was completely silent inside. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard the heavy iron door at the bottom of the stairwell open. She waited for a moment, and sure enough, she saw Ethan. But his appearance startled her. He was walking up the stairs, unwrapping a bandage from his arm. He was thinking that his friend, Zoe, was completely unreliable. She had wrapped his hand up like a giant white club, complete with a bow. Ethan, Kira whispered, her eyes wide. Are you okay? Ethan looked up, and the first thing he saw was the strawberry cake, glowing softly under the dim hallway light. It was the first time he had ever eaten cake with a small fork. Usually, at birthday parties, he either didn't eat cake or just had a symbolic bite. This time, he studied the slice for a long time before picking up the small fork with his uninjured left hand. He clumsily ate it, piece by piece, then scraped the plate clean of any remaining cream, carefully trying to make out the raised letters on the bottom. HoloLand. The next day, Ethan, with his bandaged club, rode his bike all over the small town. He went down every street and alley but couldn't find a bakery called Holloland. He later learned that Caleb had bought it in Beijing and brought it back especially. He had always thought that where you were and what you did didn't really matter. But that small piece of cake made him suddenly think that maybe, just maybe, some things were different. In 2008, Ethan went to college in Beijing. His first purchase was a small slice of strawberry cake from that same Holloland bakery Caleb had gone to. Caleb had heard from Kira about Ethan's injury and sighed to himself. He thought that when he had seen him earlier, he should have just dragged him away. At least it might have saved him from one fight. He had always known Ethan wasn't a model student, but he had never seen him fight, couldn't even imagine it. It wasn't until he saw Ethan, with his own bleeding hand, punching someone in the face again and again, that he suddenly felt he couldn't let the boy continue down this path. That day, a friend of Caleb's had returned from a trip, and a few of their old high school buddies who were in town for the weekend decided to get together. After dinner, they headed to a nearby pool hall. On a weekend night, the place was packed. The owner led them to the table they had reserved, and as Caleb's gaze swept across the room, it suddenly landed on Ethan. There was a group of what were clearly high school students, with flashy hair colors and provocative clothes. A few of them were smoking. Ethan wasn't with them, but sitting alone in a corner, leaning back in a chair and playing on a handheld game console. But Caleb squinted. The kid was smoking too. Both of Ethan's hands were occupied with the game, and he exhaled a plume of smoke from between his lips. A girl in black hot pants walked over, smiling, and reached for the cigarette in his mouth, but Ethan moved his head just in time to avoid her touch. He looked up, gave her a cool glance, then took the cigarette from his lips himself and tapped the ash off. He had a certain style, Caleb had to admit. Witnessing this scene, Caleb didn't know what to think. Should he be proud that the kid from across the hall had such a commanding presence? Or should he be concerned that he had such a thuggish air at such a young age? With his hands in his pockets, Caleb casually strolled over. "Hey man, got a light?" The pool hall was noisy, and Ethan barely heard the words, unable to recognize the speaker's voice. He had no problem with the request, but he was very annoyed by the hand that had just been placed on his shoulder. He freed one hand and impatiently fished a lighter out of his pocket, holding it out behind him without looking back. But the person behind him didn't take it, and the hand on his shoulder didn't move. Game over. He couldn't play with one hand, and the little character on the screen died a gruesome death. Ethan's annoyance, fueled by the hand on his shoulder, instantly boiled over. He shot to his feet, but when he saw who it was, his anger immediately fizzled out. Ethan stammered, "Caleb." The cigarette was still between his lips, and as he said the name, it fell to the floor. Caleb tilted his head, a lazy smile on his face under the swinging overhead lights. "Were you about to hit me?" Ethan's brow furrowed in frustration. "No." He bent down to pick up the cigarette and stubbed it out on the small table next to him. His long fingers held the cigarette for a long time, hesitating, crushing the unburnt tobacco until it spilled out in a messy pile. "How about I borrow a cigarette instead? Let's see what you're smoking." Ethan didn't move right away. He looked at Caleb, who was still smiling, unable to gauge his mood. He wasn't sure if Caleb was angry. One of the boys from Ethan's group sauntered over, raising an eyebrow at Caleb, then asked Ethan, who was looking grim, "What's up?" "It's none of your business," Ethan said, pushing him away. He turned back to see that the rest of his friends had stopped playing pool and were now staring at them, looking ready for a fight. Ethan felt a wave of defeat. He took a step forward and held out a pack of cigarettes. A soft pack of premium cigarettes. Caleb glanced at it, The kid had expensive taste. He took the pack without ceremony, pulled one out, and then gestured toward Ethan. Light. This time, Ethan didn't obey. He didn't hand the lighter to Caleb. Instead, he leaned in and lit the cigarette for him. As Caleb lowered his head to the flame, Ethan stared at his face. It was the first time he had been this close enough to see his eyelashes. They were long and beautiful, especially when he blinked. Ethan didn't realize how submissive he was being until Caleb waved goodbye and walked away, taking the pack of cigarettes with him. It was only then, seeing the shocked looks on his friends' faces, that he realized he hadn't been acting much like a leader. Throughout the evening, Caleb toyed with the pack of cigarettes, occasionally glancing over at Ethan. Ethan spent most of his time playing his game, but whenever he did step up to the pool table, his shots drew cheers from his friends. Caleb watched, thinking to himself that he had been wrong to think Ethan lacked presence. At 11 o'clock, the crowd in the pool hall had thinned out. The main doors were suddenly thrown open just as Caleb was leaning over the table, aiming for the final black ball. With a soft thud, the ball dropped into the pocket. Before he could congratulate himself, he heard a series of gasps. When he turned around, he was completely stunned. Shards of broken glass were embedded in Ethan's shoulder, and two groups of people were already shouting and surging toward each other. No one knew how the chaos had started. All they knew was that in the blink of an eye, chairs were being smashed, broken beer bottles were everywhere, and people were red-eyed with rage. Caleb watched in horror as Ethan, his hand dripping with blood, knocked one person down, grabbed him by the collar, and punched him in the face again and again. This was an Ethan that Caleb had never seen before. Violent, ruthless, and merciless. None of it matched the image Caleb had of him. Caleb immediately started forward, but a friend stopped him. He patted his friend's shoulder and said, "The kid from across the hall is in there." And the kid from across the hall had lost control. He had been watching Caleb play pool and hadn't even heard the door being thrown open or his friend's S. He had been caught completely off guard when the beer bottle smashed into his shoulder. Caleb wrapped his arms around Ethan's waist, trying to pull him away, but the body in his arms kept struggling. It wasn't until Ethan's elbow slammed into Caleb's eye that Caleb let out a pained grunt. Only then did Ethan realize who was holding him. "What happened?" he asked in a panic, turning around. He saw that Caleb's right eye was watering and quickly turning red. He was incoherent, afraid to touch Caleb's eye. "Let me see." Just then, the bouncers the owner had called arrived. A few tough-looking men started yelling at the out-of-control teenagers, one of them banging a metal pipe on a table. "Hey, everyone stop right now. Anyone moves, and I'll break their legs." Caleb held an ice pack to his eye while he settled the damages with the owner. He ignored his friend's offers to take them to the hospital and instead pulled Ethan into his car. Inside the car, Caleb tossed the ice pack aside, turned on the interior light, and started the engine. "My place, your place, or the hospital? Pick one," he said, staring straight ahead. He added calmly, "But I don't think you or I can handle a shoulder full of glass." Ethan hadn't dared to breathe since getting into the car. He kept glancing at the tight line of Caleb's jaw. Anyone could see that Caleb was angry. This was the first time he had ever seen him look like this. "The hospital," Ethan answered quickly. At the hospital, Caleb frowned as he watched the doctor clean Ethan's wound. Ethan, meanwhile, kept stealing glances at Caleb. Whenever their eyes met, Ethan would quickly look away, feeling guilty. He couldn't believe his bad luck. He hadn't been in a fight for a while, and the one time he did, Caleb was there to see it. And it had to be a particularly nasty one. The nurse was chatty, lecturing him as she worked. Young people shouldn't be so impulsive. What if something terrible happened? Just the other day, a boy came in with a stab wound from a fight. Almost didn't make it. His mother was crying her eyes out. With every word she said, Caleb's frown deepened. Ethan looked at the nurse's moving lips and felt a sense of dread. After leaving the hospital, Caleb sat in the car and rolled down the window. He took out the pack of premium cigarettes he'd taken from Ethan and asked, "Want one?" Ethan was trying to figure out how to explain what had happened when he heard the question and instinctively reached out his hand. Caleb let out a short, humorless laugh. Ethan quickly pulled his hand back and shook his head. No. Caleb got out of the car and stood by the door, finishing a cigarette before getting back in. "Your eye. Remember to use the ice pack like the doctor said," Ethan said awkwardly, his brain struggling to find the right words. "Yeah," Caleb replied, but he made no move to leave. Ethan clenched his fists, waiting for him to speak. Caleb tried to say something, but he had no experience with this kind of situation. Both he and Kira had been well-behaved kids who never got into trouble. None of his friends were the type to solve problems with their fists. He had never had to lecture anyone about fighting. And Ethan was his neighbor, a younger kid he had known for years. He was 6 years older, not a parent or a relative, not even really a friend. He didn't feel he had the right to discipline him, but he also didn't want to see him like this again. "Ethan." "Yeah." Ethan answered softly. "Does it hurt?" Caleb asked. Ethan shook his head. "No." Caleb rested his hands on the steering wheel and turned to look at him. After a long silence, he spoke again. "You're a senior. Shouldn't you be studying?" Ethan didn't know what to say. Should he tell him his grades weren't actually that bad? Or that he hated being at school? When Ethan didn't answer, Caleb asked, "Have you thought about college?" Ethan was taken aback. College. It was the word his teachers used most often. At the beginning of the school year, they had even made everyone write their dream college on a leaf-shaped sticky note and put it on a large paper tree on the classroom wall. The tree was covered in the aspirations of the entire class. Ethan hadn't written one and had been lectured by his homeroom teacher for it. But he had spent the entire lecture watching a clumsy bird outside the office window. "If you don't like it here, you can go to a college far away. You've always missed your dad and your brother, right? You could go to college in Shanghai. If you want to know about different universities, different majors, I can tell you about them." Caleb's expression finally softened. He looked at the silent, lost-looking boy beside him, reached out and patted his thigh a couple of times. He asked in a gentle, persuasive tone, "You have less than a year. Choose a major you like, get into a college you like, and then live the life you want. Wouldn't that be better?" A life he wanted. Ethan had, in fact, overheard his classmates talking about college and their future majors while he was resting at his desk. "I want to be a doctor, but my parents say it's too tiring. I want to study finance because it pays well. My parents want me to study engineering because having a technical skill is something no one can take away from you." The lively discussions sometimes gave Ethan the illusion that everyone had someone who had expectations for them. There were many things Ethan was not good at, but the thing he was worst at was talking to people. The car was silent, so quiet he could feel the dull ache in his shoulder slowly intensifying, the pain coiling around his heart. "Ethan," Caleb said softly when he still hadn't answered. Ethan looked up and met his eyes. In his limited memory, Caleb had always been patient, just like now. He would say his name and then, in a gentle voice, he would talk. The car's interior light was off, the only illumination coming from the streetlights filtering through the windshield. It was dim, intimate, but somehow, Caleb's face seemed incredibly clear in the faint light. Ethan's hands, resting on his lap, twitched. His finger brushed against a tear in his pants from the fight. The frayed fabric was soft against his fingertip. Okay. With that one simple word, Ethan answered Caleb's complex question, neatly ending their conversation. Caleb wasn't sure if his talk had been successful, but as he pulled up to the curb, he studied Ethan's expression. The boy was looking out the window, his face calm, his thoughts unreadable. He probably took some of it to heart, Caleb thought. It was almost 2 in the morning when they got home. As they walked up the stairs, Caleb was still quietly repeating the nurse's instructions. Ethan nodded obediently and said good night at his door. But when he reached into his pocket, he realized his key wasn't there. Caleb had already unlocked his own door. He pulled the key out and turned to see Ethan standing there awkwardly. "Forgot your key?" "I think so." Ethan wasn't sure if he had forgotten it or lost it in the fight, but he nodded. "Is Ms. West home?" Caleb asked. Then, realizing the time, he shook his head. "Never mind. Just sleep at my place." Ethan had no intention of knocking on his own door. If his mother was home, waking her up now would mean waking up the entire building with her shouting. But he didn't want to go to Caleb's place either. "No, it's fine. I'll just get a room at the motel down the street." "What motel?" Caleb said, holding his door open and gesturing for Ethan to come in. Ethan still shook his head. It was still summer, so after getting his shoulder bandaged, he had just pulled his t-shirt, now with one sleeve cut off, back on. The tattered black shirt, combined with the white bandage, made him look quite pathetic. Caleb was exhausted. He considered his options. Physically drag the injured boy inside, or continue to reason with him. After comparing their heights, he decided on the latter. "It doesn't matter what my parents." "Caleb," Ethan suddenly interrupted. Caleb, tired and slow to react, just said, "Huh?" Ethan didn't know why he did it. He looked at Caleb, whose eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue, and quickly said, "Don't worry about me. You should get some rest." Then he turned and ran down the stairs. His sudden actions caught Caleb completely off guard. It was too late to shout, so he just called out his name in a low voice, quickly closed his door, and chased after him. But when he got downstairs, there was no sign of Ethan in the vast darkness. The next evening, Caleb ran into Ms. West. She was wearing a burgundy dress and furiously kicking her front door with her pointed high heels, cursing under her breath. When she saw Caleb, she laughed, took a drag from her cigarette, and exhaled a cloud of smoke. Did the little bastard change the locks? Bright red nails, bright red lips, a pale white cigarette, and a wisp of smoke. In a movie, it would have been a beautifully cynical shot of a femme fatale. A beautiful woman. Even Caleb had to admit it. Ms. West had a kind of repellent allure that not many older women possessed. For better or worse, she was unique. Caleb lowered his eyes and said politely, "I don't know." Even as he walked downstairs, he could still hear the loud thud of her kicking, mixed with increasingly vile curses. Strangely enough, after that night, Caleb came home several more times but never saw Ethan. The apartment across the hall was as quiet as if it were uninhabited. Caleb didn't know if Ethan had a phone, so despite his worry, he had no way to contact him. Then, one morning, as he was coming back from grocery shopping, he saw a girl. She was cautiously pressing her ear to Ethan's door, listening. When she saw Caleb, she quickly straightened up and gave him a shy, embarrassed nod. Caleb watched as she knocked on the door, and then, seemingly satisfied that no one was home, she took out a key. He found this odd and, after a moment's hesitation, asked politely, "Excuse me, are you a friend of Ethan's?" The sudden voice startled the girl. She spun around to face the man holding a bag of groceries. "Oh yes, I am," she stammered. Then, as if remembering something, she quickly waved her hands and added, "I'm not a thief. I'm just getting something for him." Caleb nodded, relieved. "How is he?" "He's—" The girl started to speak, then stopped herself, pressing her lips together. After a long pause, she said, "He's fine. It's the weekend, so we're going out." "A girlfriend?" The thought of them dating popped into Caleb's head, and he quickly dismissed it. Everyone had their first crush. A relationship was better than fighting. He didn't think any more of it and just said, "Okay." Zoe returned to the hospital with the things Ethan had asked for. She found him still lying in bed, determinedly working on a science exam with his one good arm. "Got your stuff. Here's your key," she said, handing it to him. She added worriedly, "Don't lose it again." Ethan grunted without looking up. "Just put it there." A few minutes later, he finished the last biology question, closed his eyes, and tossed the exam booklet to Zoe. Zoe took out a red pen and quickly graded it. Then she held up the paper, which had a score of 256, in front of his face. "Keep trying, kid." Ethan opened his eyes and glanced at the paper. "What did you get?" Zoe smiled. 288. Ethan snatched the paper back and started reviewing his mistakes in silence. Zoe couldn't help but laugh at his competitive expression. She pulled her chair closer to his bed. "Come on, let your esteemed study partner explain it to you." Ethan shot her a look. "Don't push it." Zoe was unfazed by his scowl. She just kept smiling. "Hey, 256 is not bad. You still have plenty of room for improvement." No one could believe that Zoe and Ethan were friends. It was a mystery to everyone. But for some reason, Ethan had been fiercely protective of this seemingly ordinary girl for years. There was even a rumor that he had once beaten up several boys who had made fun of Zoe's weight, then made them line up and apologize to her one by one. Ethan hadn't made many mistakes, and most of them were in biology and chemistry, sections that required memorization. Zoe quickly went over them with him. She watched as he frowned, awkwardly trying to highlight passages in his textbook. She couldn't help but say, "Are you crazy? Who picks a fight like that?" That morning at school, she had heard that Ethan had gotten into a huge fight with a group from another school. The news had even reached their advanced placement class, which was usually isolated from the rest of the school, so it must have been a big deal. Zoe was carrying a stack of math papers when she heard some of the more boisterous boys in her class talking about Ethan. "Dude, he took on a whole group by himself. He got his ass kicked, but still, that's insane. It's like he was trying to get himself killed. Let's see what Mr. Peterson does now. I heard the principal wanted to kick him out of the AP program after his last fight, but Mr. Peterson refused. This time, I don't know if he can still protect him. I doubt it. If his grades were amazing, maybe Mr. Peterson would have a stronger case." Zoe walked over to them, her face impassive, and slapped the stack of papers on their desk. 101. The boys' discussion was cut short. They stared at her, confused. Zoe ignored them and walked over to Ethan's empty desk, placing another paper on it. She wanted to read the score on that paper out loud, so they could all hear who it was that didn't have amazing grades. But she knew that some people just wouldn't get the hint. Ethan knew what people were saying about him. He even knew the parts that hadn't become common knowledge. After that brutal fight, he was lying on a gurney in the emergency room, and the guy who had been causing him trouble was sitting nearby, glaring at him. Ethan was getting annoyed and finally told him to stop staring, that they had agreed to call it even. His nonchalant words infuriated the other guy. "Are you a fucking idiot?" he yelled. He couldn't understand it. In their last fight at the pool hall, Ethan's side had basically won. So why was he picking another fight? If anyone should have been looking for a rematch, it should have been them. He grimaced as the nurse cleaned his wounds and cursed, "My cuts were just starting to heal, and now I have to go through this shit again because of you. Don't you know the rules? You're supposed to give a guy a chance to recover." Ethan was getting tired of the constant swearing. He looked at the guy and said, with a humorless smile, "I told you I'm done. I wanted to settle everything at once, to avoid any future trouble." The other guy, sweating from the sting of the antiseptic, shot back, "Done with what?" "I'm done with all this," Ethan said, looking at the ceiling, his voice suddenly serious. "I'm a senior. I need to study." The other guy stared at him, dumbfounded. He was clearly at a loss for words. After a long pause, he spat on the floor and muttered, "Fucking idiot." This time, Ethan didn't use his fists to shut him up. He couldn't move anyway, and he had no desire to fight anymore. He just gave him an emotionless look and lay there in silence. And with that, the other guy finally believed him. Ethan didn't know how the story would be twisted by the people he used to fight with. Maybe when they were drinking together, they would all bring up his name, mock him as a fucking idiot, and then laugh together. But he knew that this chaotic chapter of his life, the part that Caleb disapproved of, was truly over. If you wanted to fight, you could always find a reason. Today, I'll get you for something you did that pissed me off. Tomorrow, I'll get my revenge. Never ends. There was no such thing as forgiveness among high school kids. If you wanted to quit the game, you had to pay a price, which included shedding unnecessary blood and earning the title of Ethan, that fucking idiot. As winter set in, the northern air became dry and harsh. One morning, Caleb even got a nosebleed while washing his face. It was an old problem. Every winter, his nose became extremely sensitive. He stuffed some tissues up his nostrils and tilted his head back. "What's wrong with you?" his roommate, Adam, asked, squinting to see him as he was putting on his shoes. He started to walk over but tripped on a loose network cable, causing a clatter. "Careful," Caleb said. Adam was severely nearsighted but refused to wear his glasses for long periods, claiming they would change the shape of his eyes. Caleb had to admire his persistence. He tripped over things a dozen times a day but never seemed to mind. "It's nothing, just the dry air." Adam said he had to go to a company for a research project and left early with his backpack. Caleb tossed him a bagel for the road. A senior student had asked Caleb to help mentor an undergraduate robotics team. The undergrads had apparently asked several times, but the senior was too busy. Just as Caleb was about to head over, he got a call from one of the undergrads. He said they had all gotten food poisoning from a team dinner the night before and were currently at the hospital on 4 drips. He asked if they could reschedule. Caleb, of course, agreed. He asked a few questions to make sure they were okay and then hung up. With his schedule suddenly free, and after having spent the last week slaving over a research paper, the last thing Caleb wanted to do was go to the lab. He put on some music, cleaned the dorm room, and carefully secured the loose network cable. With nothing else to do, he decided to buy a train ticket and go home. He had lent his car to a friend for the weekend, thinking he would be at school. His mother, Julia, was surprised to see him. "I thought you weren't coming back. Have you eaten?" I had something to do, but it got canceled, so I came home." Julia took the bag he was carrying. "What's this?" "A humidifier." Julia frowned, but before she could say anything, Caleb cut her off. "I know we have one. This is for your room. It's been really dry lately." Julia gave him a look and started lecturing him about wasting money. Caleb just smiled, changed into his slippers, and, noticing the empty house, asked, "Where are Dad and Kira?" "I sent them to your grandma's. I just finished cleaning. There's so much dust this time of year, and with the heat on, it's not just them, even I can't stand it." As she spoke, Julia took the jacket Caleb had just taken off and pinched the sleeve in disgust. "Look at this cuff. It's filthy. How can it be? I just washed it. I've only worn it for 2 days. You probably didn't scrub the cuffs when you washed it last time. Cuffs and collars, you have to scrub them with soap separately. Just throwing it in the washing machine won't get it clean. I'll wash it for you again." Caleb drank a large glass of water to quench his thirst. Hearing the washing machine whirring, he sighed and put his arm around his mother's shoulder, taking the jacket from her and guiding her to the sofa. "It's fine, Mom. I'll wash it myself when I get back. You should rest. I'm leaving tomorrow. It won't be dry by then if you wash it now. You don't wash it properly. I'll wash it and hang it on the radiator. It'll be dry by morning. You're so busy at school. This will save you the trouble." They argued for a while, but Caleb couldn't win against his mother. He watched as she took his jacket, emptied the pockets onto the coffee table, and went into the bathroom. "Oh, right," Julia called out, her hands covered in soap suds. "Your uncle said to have you come over when you got back. Your cousin is a senior now and wants to apply for early admission. I remember you helped with your school's early admission program, right? You should go talk to him. Why don't you go now? He's home from school today." Later, Caleb said, setting up the humidifier and yawning, "I'm going to take a nap first. I'm exhausted." Caleb wasn't a very energetic person and had a habit of taking afternoon naps, even if it was just for 15 minutes. He dozed off and was woken up by the sound of the front door closing. He was a light sleeper, and even though there was a door between them, the sound seemed amplified in his ears. "Caleb? What are you doing here?" Kira was surprised to see him walk out of his room in his pajamas. She quickly stuffed a bag she was holding into the shoe cabinet. "Not happy to see me?" Caleb pretended not to notice her furtive action and asked casually, "Why are you back by yourself? Where's Dad?" "He's still at Grandma's," Kira said quietly. She bent down to change into her slippers, her short hair falling forward and hiding her face. When she stood up again, her cheeks were flushed. Caleb stood in front of her and stared at her face for a few seconds before suddenly reaching for the cabinet door. Kira quickly pressed her hand against the door and said urgently, "Hey, you can't look." Caleb laughed at her defensive posture. He could guess what was in the bag anyway. He decided to let it go and preserve her little secret. After laughing, he noticed that Kira was wearing a pink down jacket he had never seen before. "New jacket?" he asked, gently turning her around. "It looks good." The jacket was a slightly longer, A-line style with a fluffy bottom and a small pink pom-pom on the hood. It was very cute. Kira glanced at him and mumbled a yes. Just then, Julia came out and saw the jacket. "I thought you were at Grandma's. Did you go shopping?" Kira looked at her mother, at a loss for words. Julia was also pleased with the jacket. She never minded the extra effort of washing light-colored clothes and liked to dress Kira like a little princess. "Good thing you bought it. It got cold all of a sudden this afternoon. I was worried you weren't wearing enough. I was thinking of bringing you a jacket, but then I figured you wouldn't be going outside and could just take a cab home, so I didn't." Kira nodded along, took off the down jacket, and hung it on the coat rack, then took off the small white fleece jacket she was wearing underneath. She glanced at Caleb, then, instead of going to her room, she shuffled over to the living room and sat down. Caleb looked at the pink down jacket on the rack, then at Kira, who kept stealing glances in his direction. Something was definitely up. As he was thinking, he noticed something missing from the coat rack. He moved Kira's jacket and fleece aside and saw that the jacket he had been wearing was gone. And it wasn't just the jacket. All the clothes he had brought back were now hanging on the radiator. Caleb didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Mom, why did you wash everything? What am I going to wear now? Just find something else, Julia called from the kitchen. If I wash it for you now, you won't have to do it when you get back. Caleb sighed in defeat. He gave his mother, who had just come out with a fruit platter, a silent hug, popped a slice of apple into his mouth, and went to his room to find something else to wear. He didn't have many clothes at home. He kept most of his things at school and hadn't brought anything back this time. He rummaged through his closet for a long time before putting together an outfit he thought was acceptable. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He couldn't remember when he had bought the white, preppy-style sweater. He had hardly ever worn it. Paired with a light khaki, mid-length duffel coat and light-colored jeans, he looked like he was trying to look younger. This outfit would have been more appropriate when he was a freshman. He told his mother he was leaving, took out a bag of trash, and went out. As soon as he stepped outside the building, a cold wind hit him, and he shivered, quickly pulling up his hood. As he was throwing the trash into the dumpster, the usually aloof black cat surprisingly rubbed against his leg. Caleb crouched down to look at it. The cat just tucked its head in but didn't back away. He thought it must be hungry, but it didn't look thin at all. In fact, it seemed to have put on some weight. "You're eating well, aren't you?" he murmured. Just then, he heard the sound of bicycle brakes. He looked up and saw Ethan, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. He was only wearing a thin tracksuit. "Aren't you cold in that?" Caleb asked, standing up and walking toward him with a smile. Ethan had already pulled out his earphones when he saw Caleb. "No, being young and healthy doesn't mean you should be reckless," Caleb said, looking at Ethan's red hands and ears. "I got frostbite on my ears when I was a kid. It was awful, and now they get cold easily every winter. You should get a pair of gloves if you're going to be riding your bike, and cover your head, too." Ethan listened and nodded. They stood in silence for a moment before the black cat meowed. Ethan got off his bike and put down the kickstand. "Is that for him?" Caleb asked, noticing the semi-transparent plastic bag in Ethan's hand, which seemed to contain beef jerky. "Yeah, he's picky. I bought him cat food before, but he wouldn't eat it. He only eats this kind of jerky." As Ethan spoke, he tried to open the bag, but the headphone cord, which he must have pulled out too hastily, had gotten tangled with the plastic bag. He fumbled with his red, cold fingers, unable to find the knot. "Let me," Caleb said, taking the tangled mess from his hands. With a few deft movements, he separated them. Ethan took the bag back and crouched down to feed the cat without a word. "Are you going out?" Ethan asked. "Yeah, to my uncle's house." The black cat was eating happily. Ethan didn't know what else to say to Caleb, who was standing beside him, so he just pretended to watch the cat eat. A hand appeared in front of him. Caleb's, holding out the neatly coiled white earphone cord, his index finger and thumb pinching it together. Ethan followed the hand up to Caleb's face. He was still wearing his hood and was crouching beside him, also looking at him. It was only then that Ethan realized why he found Caleb particularly handsome today. He was dressed differently, younger. The duffel coat's hood was large and covered half of his forehead, perfectly framing his eyes and brows. The edge of the hood seemed to draw a line, emphasizing his eyes. And when Caleb smiled, his eyes curved into crescents. "Do you feed him every day?" Caleb's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. "Pretty much," Ethan said, looking down to hide his wandering mind. "Whenever I'm back." "That explains why he looks so healthy," Caleb said. Although Ethan wished the cat would eat a little slower, the cat clearly didn't share his sentiment. It quickly finished the 2 sticks of jerky, looked up at Ethan, and meowed, as if placing an order for tomorrow before running off. The cat was gone, and Caleb said he had to leave too. Ethan silently crumpled the plastic bag in his hand and tossed it into a nearby trash can. Caleb had already started walking away, his hands in his pockets, when he remembered the early admission thing. "Ethan," he called out. When he turned around, he saw that Ethan hadn't moved. He was just standing there, watching him. Caleb didn't know if it was the dim light or the cold wind, but the look in Ethan's eyes stayed with him for many years. So much so that whenever he remembered it, he felt an urgent need to see the boy smile. There was no expectation, not even a sense of waiting, just a quiet, undisturbed loneliness. He was suddenly reminded of the black cat, looking up at him with its pleading eyes. "Have you eaten yet?" Maybe people and cats really do become alike after spending a lot of time together. Caleb's question had changed, because he suddenly couldn't bear to leave Ethan, who was looking at him like that, alone in the deepening night. A few steps away, Ethan blinked, as if surprised by the question. "You haven't, have you? Come on, I'll treat you to dinner." Caleb saw a flicker of light in Ethan's eyes, but he still hesitated. "Aren't you going to your uncle's?" "I didn't tell them I was coming. We can grab a bite and I'll go over after." This was before smartphones were ubiquitous, so they couldn't just pull up an app to find a place to eat. They had to rely on their memory of good local restaurants. Worried that Ethan might be too shy to choose, Caleb suggested a few places he liked. He wanted to treat him to a nice meal, but Ethan said, "I want noodles." "Noodles? There's a noodle shop nearby, Mr. Wong's," Ethan said, gesturing vaguely. "It's just around the corner at the second intersection." Caleb thought for a moment and remembered the place from his high school days. "Oh, that one. I haven't been there in years. Is it still open?" Ethan nodded, looking at him earnestly. "Okay," Caleb agreed. He considered the distance and suggested, "I didn't drive back. We can take a cab." But Ethan was already walking toward his bike. He stood in front of Caleb and hesitated for a moment. "It's not that far. How about, I give you a ride?" Caleb's mind went off on a tangent. He was surprised to see that the corners of Ethan's mouth were turned up in a slight smile. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. The first thought that came to Caleb's mind was, "It's so easy to make him happy." "Okay," he said, not mentioning the cold and indulging him. But when he saw the bike, he shook his head with a smile. "There's no back seat." "There's the crossbar," Ethan said quickly. Caleb looked. The crossbar was slanted. He looked up, intending to explain to Ethan that it would be impossible to sit on. But when he met the boy's hopeful gaze, he found himself, against his better judgment, smiling and saying, "Okay." As he got on the bike, Caleb took off his hood, afraid of blocking Ethan's view. "Don't take it off. It's cold. Your ears will get cold," Ethan said from behind him. "It's fine," Caleb said, leaning forward and gripping the handlebars to steady himself. "I'll block your view." "You won't," Ethan said quickly. He added, as if to explain, "You're not that tall. You won't block my view even with the hood on." Caleb, who had been ready to go, paused and turned his head, his eyes slightly wide. Ethan looked back at him, confused. "Are you saying I'm short?" Caleb asked, tilting his head. Ethan finally understood. He mentally kicked himself and quickly shook his head, trying to backtrack. "Not short. Average height." Average height? He was just under 6 feet, not tall by any means, but unless he was standing next to a giant like Ethan, he thought his height was perfectly adequate. What kind of a comment was average height? Caleb was speechless. He glanced at Ethan, who was looking at him with a serious expression. And then, with a sigh, he pulled the hood back up. "If it doesn't block your view, then fine. It's warmer this way. Let's go." "One side of your hood isn't on right," Ethan said. He looked at Caleb, who was staring straight ahead, and stealthily reached out 2 fingers to adjust the edge of the hood. It was a small, secret movement, but it seemed to pull the corners of his own mouth up into a smile. The advantage of being tall was having long arms and legs. Caleb sat in front of Ethan, but it didn't feel crowded at all. Even so, by the time they left the apartment complex, Caleb was already regretting his decision. The slanted crossbar was extremely uncomfortable. His butt hurt and he kept sliding backward. He had to grip the handlebars tightly to keep himself in place, but he was afraid of affecting Ethan's steering, so he couldn't put his full weight on them. The whole ride, Caleb was struggling to find a balance on the annoying slanted bar. Ethan, on the other hand, was completely at ease, smiling and riding steadily. "Look at your hands. And you said you weren't cold?" Caleb said, frowning. He covered Ethan's red hand with his own left hand. Whoa! The handlebars wobbled, and Caleb, caught off guard, lurched forward, his hand tightening on Ethan's in surprise. After steadying the bike, Ethan's gaze darted away, then was drawn back to the hand on his, as if it were weighted down with lead. The warmth became a tangible thing, along with the budding desire to touch him. His heart started racing and never slowed down. When Ethan stopped the bike and let him off, Caleb seemed to say something to him, but Ethan didn't hear it. All he saw was Caleb smiling at him. In a daze, he reached out to steady Caleb as he got off the bike. The noodle shop had been renovated. It was much cleaner and brighter than Caleb remembered. The aroma of hot soup warmed them up as soon as they walked in. There weren't many customers, so they chose a small table for 2 and ordered 2 bowls of beef noodles. 1 signature, 1 spicy. "No cilantro in the signature bowl," Ethan said. Caleb, who had been wiping the table with a napkin, paused and looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes. "Right?" Ethan asked. The waiter was also waiting for his confirmation. Caleb nodded, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face. After the waiter left, Caleb threw the used napkin into a nearby trash can and asked, "How did you know I don't eat cilantro?" He couldn't remember ever telling anyone that. In fact, he wasn't even that picky about it anymore. He had been a picky eater as a kid, but as he got older, whenever he ate out with his family, he had to ask about all the ingredients to check for allergens, and then add on a list of requests like no spice, no garlic, and so on. He found it to be a hassle for the waiters, so he gradually stopped mentioning his own preferences. It wasn't an allergy, just a matter of taste, so it wasn't a big deal. "When you brought me here before, you didn't get cilantro," Ethan said. He poured water into a cup, swished it around, then poured the water into another cup and put both pairs of chopsticks in to rinse them. He performed the whole ritual with a familiar ease. Caleb watched him, frowning in thought, until he finally remembered when he had brought Ethan here. A strange feeling washed over Caleb. Ethan remembered something he had almost forgotten. It was summer then, and Caleb had just finished his sophomore year final exams. He had walked home. A group of neighborhood ladies were gossiping by the entrance, but instead of their usual talk of grocery sales, they were talking about a man who had left without taking any money, and how the older son had chosen his mother. They were sighing about how foolish the boy was. How could he only care about money? The chatter soured Caleb's good mood. As he was thinking, a pristine black car drove past him. Inside was a man and a small child eating an ice cream cone, their face smeared with it. Caleb stared after the car in disbelief. The younger brother was taken away, which meant the one left behind was... The summer sun glinted off the car, then disappeared, the last thing in this small town to touch that vehicle. Ethan pushed a glass of water toward him. The cup next to him still contained the rinsing water. A waiter brought a steaming bowl of noodles, with no chili oil, and placed it in front of Caleb. Caleb quietly asked the waiter for another cup. He rinsed the new cup and filled it with water for Ethan. Then, lost in his memories, he stared into space for a long time. Ethan was quiet when he ate. It wasn't that he was silent, but he didn't speak. Caleb would occasionally ask if it was too spicy or if he wanted a drink, and Ethan would reply with short, 1- or 2-word answers or just shake his head. It wasn't until Caleb brought up the topic of early admission and asked about his recent grades that Ethan spoke up. 109th in the grade on the last exam. Caleb was surprised. Ethan's grades were much better than he had expected. What was your total score? 607. Their town was small, and even the best high school wasn't that great. But in a competitive state, the grade ranking didn't mean much, but the total score did. Caleb thought for a moment, analyzing the situation. With that score, you could probably get into a school in Shanghai, but maybe not the best ones. You should really consider early admission. The school has nomination spots, and you can also apply on your own. If you want to try, I can help you with the application. But Ethan quickly shook his head. The steam from his noodles rose up, creating a misty barrier between them. I'm not applying. He put down his chopsticks, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and explained, I have a disciplinary record for fighting. It's useless. Ethan said it casually, but Caleb felt a headache coming on. But there was no point in lecturing him now. He just wondered how much the disciplinary record would affect him. Is it on your permanent record? Ethan shook his head, saying he didn't know. If it is, it could be a problem. Your record follows you for life. Caleb said, then reconsidered. Maybe it wasn't that serious. In a small-town high school, the administration wasn't always that strict. Even if they said it was on his record, it might not actually be. Why don't you ask your homeroom teacher? See what the official punishment was and if there's any way to appeal it. Ethan looked at him and, after a moment of silence, shook his head again. It was a long time ago. The guy I fought, his dad works for the Board of Education or something. They put all the blame on me. There's nothing to talk about. Caleb understood immediately. On one side was someone with connections, and on the other was a problem student whose parents couldn't even be reached. It was an open and shut case. Ethan continued to eat his noodles as if he didn't have a care in the world. Caleb sighed and stirred his own noodles, worrying for him. The object of his concern, however, just urged him to hurry up and eat before his food got cold. After dinner, Caleb said he would take a cab to his uncle's house, but Ethan insisted on giving him a ride. Caleb looked at the bicycle and fell silent for a long time. Finally, under the boy's intense gaze, he gave in. Fine. The road was darker now. As they turned onto a side street, the streetlights cast a dim, yellow glow, creating visible beams of light in the dark night. Caleb hadn't been down this road at night in a long time. He looked up and smiled. The streetlights here are still the same. What do you mean? Ethan asked. When I was in high school, I used to take this shortcut home every day. I don't know what it's like now, but back then, because it was so quiet and romantic, I would always see a couple of couples here. One on the east end, one on the west end, like they had divided the street between them. Caleb chuckled. So every day, I would ride my bike through here and watch their public displays of affection. Sometimes the guy would be giving his girlfriend a piggyback ride. Sometimes they would be hugging under a streetlight. It was different every day. Then, right before graduation, on the last day I saw them, one of the guys actually waved to me and said hi. Perhaps because he was talking to a teenager who was going through the same high school experience, Caleb felt a wave of nostalgia and started reminiscing. Ethan listened to him laugh and smiled himself. What did he say? Caleb deepened his voice, imitating the boy. Hey man, thanks for putting up with us all this time. Good luck on your exams. Ethan burst out laughing. Caleb heard the sound and turned to look at him in surprise. What's so funny? Nothing. You just have a really low bar for humor. Ethan kept smiling, not saying anything. He was picturing Caleb as a high school student, riding his bike down the street, watching the two couples, and then responding to the boy's final greeting. He imagined it would have been very endearing. Caleb didn't know what he was laughing at, but seeing him so happy made him want to smile too. He turned back around and pulled his hood tighter. In the days that followed, Ethan would ride his bike down this road every day after a long day of studying. Sometimes he would race down it, listening to the wind whistle past his ears. Sometimes he would ride slowly, weaving back and forth across the road. But no matter how he rode, he would always think of Caleb, who had once sat in front of him and ridden down this road with him. Years later, when he heard someone humming the line, "The moonlight is so beautiful tonight," the image that appeared in his mind was the crescent moon from that night. The streetlights were beautiful, the new moon was beautiful, and the light danced on Caleb's fingertips, then flowed into Ethan's eyes. And in that moment of sweet recollection, all the cold and hardship in his life would melt away, leaving only a lingering warmth.